Hello, I am Beth and I'm back for another live. And today's topic, we are talking about divorce and the divorce process. Thinking about divorce is scary, it's overwhelming, there's so many emotions, there's so much to talk about when it comes to finances and kids, lifestyle, home, mutual friends. So today I have my friend Leanne Townsend, who is a divorce lawyer. She's a family law lawyer, and she is here to help us dispel. And she is a family lawyer out of Toronto. And her practice focuses on family law, domestic violence, victim advocacy, and she's appeared as an expert in so many national publications. She focuses on abusive relationships, divorcing a narcissist, co-parenting, women empowerment, and so much more. So, Leanne, I want to welcome
Thank
you
you. I'm
today.
excited
Thanks
to
for
be
coming
here.
on.
Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, and I'm excited that you're Canadian, like me. We are like 2 hours apart, which is phenomenal. So I guess before we get started, I have a lot of followers that are from around the world, a lot in the US and a lot in Australia. Just curious, the things that we're going to talk about in regards to divorce, are a lot of them kind of generic in some aspects? Do you have any thoughts on that as we talk about some of the ins and outs that we missed in
Certain
dispelling them?
aspects are generic, but I mean, obviously the law in each jurisdiction can be a little bit different. And I'm only licensed to practice law here in Ontario, Canada. So any information that's really specific that I provide would only be applicable here in Ontario. It might be similar in other places, but I just want to make it clear that I'm speaking from the Ontario perspective, but some of the sort of more general stuff is applicable, I think, no matter where you are.
Excellent. Okay, I'm glad we kind of opened with that. So let's get into it. Just to even start off the whole topic of divorce, what do you find in your own practice? What are the high risk periods? I've read that it's anywhere from that 1 to 2, those first couple of years, but then it's anywhere kind of that 7 year itch, 5 to 8 years is where we see a lot of the divorces happening. Would you agree that that's
I
true,
mean,
or
I
what
would
do you
agree
see in
that
your
there's truth in
practice?
that. I think like the first couple of years, often, I think they even call them starter marriages or something where, people, they get married and very quickly they realize it's not working out. They don't have kids and they decide, let's divorce. So you do see it there. And, there is some truth to that 7 year itch, but I find I also see a lot of divorces, what they call gray divorces, where it's older couples who, the children, they may be empty nesters. What kind of kept them together was they stayed together for the children, and a lot of their time together was just focused on the children, not really being a couple. And then the children moved out, or their way at university or whatever, and they kind of realized, hey, like, we have nothing in common anymore. We've grown apart. We don't want to spend the next 20-30 years together. And so people in their 50s, in 60s even, are getting divorces too.
Yeah, I agree. I see a lot of that as well. So my next question is, what are the main reasons people get divorced? And in my own experience, often it's communication, poor communication, infidelity is a big one, and also just that lack of like intimacy, connection, physical, emotional intimacy. What do you see as the
I
number
agree
one
with
reasons for
those. I
divorce?
think communication is a big one, obviously infidelity, but another one is just money issues. I think that oftentimes couples, they don't discuss money. They have different money styles. One's a spender, one's a saver, or one's, not working, and the other one is like, and it's not by a joint choice. They're just deciding not to work, or maybe they have mental health issues, and that's, interfering with their ability to work, but the other partner isn't as sympathetic with the mental health issues as maybe they could be, or they think it's not true, or things like that. And so I think there's a lot of arguments about money, and so I would say that's right up there as being one of the number one causes of divorce.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you for sharing that. My next one is, just to start this whole thing off, do couples actually need a lawyer to get divorced? So let's dispel myth number one. Do you need a lawyer to get
I
divorced?
mean, you don't actually, you can do, if all you're getting is a divorce and you don't have children. Like, if you have children, it's a little more complicated because you're going to have to worry about child support. But if you don't have children and you don't have assets to be divided, or you're, in agreement with how you're dividing things, there's online sites where you can just pay a fee and you can get a divorce online, and you can do it that way. I mean, my advice, of course, I mean, and you could say I'm biased because I'm a lawyer, is I think it's smart to get legal advice no matter what you end up doing, because maybe you have certain rights that or entitlements that you're not aware of. And if you just go and do this online thing, it could be a problem. And, I find a lot of these, we call them kitchen table agreements, where, a couple downloads something off the internet, a separation agreement, and they sit down and they, write it out. Often it's not properly done, and often they're not, they don't stand up if they ever are challenged down the road because they haven't been properly done. And essentially someone can't give up rights that they don't know about. And so that's part of the problem with doing things that way, is you may not be aware you're entitled to spousal support, or you're entitled to an equalization, and then or you have rights with the matrimonial home, and you're signing something and you're not aware of it. And so, down the road, you would be able to to unwind that agreement. And so if you want to have something that's going to stand the test of time, it's better to get legal advice. And, there's lawyers who give free consultations. There's different ways of keeping your fees down. But it is, I think, important just to understand what you're entitled to.
Amazing. Thank you for that. So I was just going to say, anyone viewing, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can generically answer them, because I know we can't technically give advice per se, but we can generically answer them for sure. So that brings me to the next point. Are divorces expensive? Let's talk about the cost.
Yeah, they can be. I mean,
the range.
If, if you're just getting a straightforward, uncontested divorce, the court fees here in Ontario run around $800. And then if you use a lawyer to do it, like generally we quote around $2,000 for filling out the forms for you and doing the filing and all of that. But obviously if people are arguing about things, that's where it's going to get expensive. If you have to go to court, it's going to be more expensive. If you go through the court process and you have to go to trial because you're just not agreeing on things with your former partner, I mean, you could have hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. So it really depends on how much you're disagreeing about. And that'll determine what the ultimate legal cost is going to be. So, I mean, you can still use lawyers and have it only be a couple of thousand, or you can, use lawyers and have it be 200,000. So it just really depends on how much you're fighting your spouse, and how complicated your issues are.
Absolutely. What would you say the average cost is? Canadian, US, what would you say the average
really
cost
hard to
of divorce
say
is?
Because, I would say for people who are, more or less in agreement and they just need a separation agreement and financial disclosure, I mean, that might be around 5,000 Canadian. But, as you say, like if you end up in court and you're fighting about things, you're looking at, tens of thousands of dollars, if not, more than that, if it ultimately goes to trial.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is, are divorces always messy? We often hear of the messy stories, so I don't know if that just kind of overrides a lot of the ones that aren't so messy, but what are your thoughts? Like, is there a percentage there? And I don't know, how do you want to describe messy, but having a lot of conflict, like heading to court because you can't agree on things. So let's talk about messy divorces. And is that the majority
I don't
of the time?
have stats on what percentage of them are messy. I mean, certainly, because I do a lot of litigation, I get involved in the messy ones because they're the ones who, need a lawyer who's going to be willing to go to court and argue on their behalf. But I do think there's a significant portion of people out there where it isn't messy. And, even things like mediation and mediation with arbitration, like those are things that are done with or without lawyers, where, the parties maybe don't agree on certain issues, but they're still able in a respectful way to negotiate with the help of, third parties and with their lawyers, a resolution. So, I mean, I wouldn't call those messy divorces. I would call messy divorces more like the high conflict ones where you're fighting everything in court. And, those ones are the ones that rack up the legal fees. Like those are the ones that are definitely way more expensive, more stressful, I think, because it's stressful having to be involved in the court, process for anybody. And there's more uncertainty because you're turning over control to a judge to decide your fate rather than having some level of control over it by trying to negotiate or do mediation. So as I say, I don't have the stats, but there's definitely lots that are not messy.
Yeah. Okay. So then my next question, if there's been adultery, an affair, infidelity, does that mean you lose everything? So I think there's a rumor, kind of myth out there that if you step outside the marriage, then you're
Well,
sacrificing
certainly
or
in
giving up on
Ontario, that's
everything.
not the case. I mean, there may be countries around the world where that are more patriarchal in their, their society and their laws and structure, and maybe that could be the case there. But certainly here in Ontario and the rest of Canada, um, infidelity is irrelevant to what you get in a divorce. We have no fault divorce, so the court doesn't care if your spouse cheated on you. They don't care if your spouse cheated on you 25 times or one time. It's irrelevant to the division of property and to child support or support. So a lot of people have a hard time with that because, they feel very wronged, understandably, and they want some vindication or revenge or, in their minds, maybe justice. This person's treated them terribly. Why shouldn't I get more as a result of what I've had to put up with? But the reality is that infidelity does not factor in at all to what you're entitled to.
Okay, so no fault divorce. So if anyone's looking up that question, then have a look to see if you're in a jurisdiction that's no fault divorce. Okay, next one. Do mothers always get custody? And I've heard too, um, I guess one of the myths, and women are more likely to get more, maybe like a 60-40. What are your thoughts on that? Mothers getting custody versus
That's an
fathers?
interesting one because we have moved as a society to, more of a shared parenting model in a lot of cases, and fathers are far more involved these days than they ever used to be. So, years ago, that sort of Wednesday night and every second weekend model for dads was very prevalent. And accept it because mothers were the primary caregiver, and so that just kind of was what naturally flowed. But today a lot of fathers are equally involved with their children and they want equal time, so we do see a lot more of that. I have found in, like, it's funny because I just was speaking with a client this morning, and he wants shared parenting time, and his ex-wife isn't agreeable to that, and she's been really limiting, like kind of controlling where the children are and limiting him, and he's been very upset about it. And when we were in court the other day, the judge was kind of saying that shared parenting isn't like the presumption. So in some cases and it is more often the mothers do have a little bit of an advantage that way. But it really depends on who's been doing what since birth, and but if you're an uninvolved father, to walk in and say, well, now I want them 50% of the time, that might be a harder thing, a harder hurdle to climb. But if you've been very involved since birth, it would be easier. But it is something, I find it still contentious. I still have a number of male clients who feel that the wife is getting to dictate the schedule, and they're not happy about that. But they're definitely, they're getting more time than fathers did years ago.
Okay, so how that sounds really tricky to prove in court. Like we're talking about the child's upbringing since childhood and how involved a parent and a mother were. Like, how do you find hard facts on that? Are you pulling out old calendars and
It's hard.
schedules?
No, it's
How do
very
you
hard
fight
because
that
it
in
ends up
court?
being like a he said, she said type thing. He says one thing, she says another. And, and that's where sometimes we get, depending on the ages of the children, we might get something called a voice of the child report. So if children are old enough to be able to articulate their preferences, we can have somebody who specializes in doing these types of reports, and they know how to relate to children, and they'll meet with the children and ascertain their preferences, or the Office of the Children's Lawyer here in Ontario can play a role doing that. And in some cases, if it's a very high conflict and there's a lot going on, the court might order something called a Section 30 assessment, which is actually done by a psychologist, and it's done over a long period of time to determine what the best arrangement, in terms of decision making and the parenting schedule is for the children, because the guiding principle in all things to do with schedule is what is in the best interests of the child, not mom, not dad, but the child. And, that's what the court really tries to look at. And so, it's like things like how close are you to the school? Like that's a factor. If when the matrimonial home is sold, if one party is moving farther away outside the school district and one is staying in the school district, that's going to affect the schedule. If one party's staying in the matrimonial home and the other party is going to be farther away, that can affect things. Because I've seen where, one parent is going to be living a 40 or 50-minute drive from the children's school, and it's not realistic every day for children to be in a car that amount of time, on an equal or shared parenting schedule. So in a situation like that, the parent, whether it's mom or dad, who's in the school district will have an advantage because, for that simple reason. So like a lot of things can be looked at, even just the person's support. Like, do they have family in the area? Do they, do the kids have friends and that the parents are friends? Like, there's a lot of things that go into those decisions. And, the dad, if he is the one that's closer to the school and has those supports, then he may, be in a position where the parenting schedule does favor him.
Okay, it's so complex, right? There's just so many levels to this process. How about this one? The kids get to pick who they want to live with. What are the rules around that?
Well, at the end of the day, when a child is 16, then they can, really decide. It's their decision. Nobody can kind of stop it. But until that point, generally the input of children, if they're, again, old enough, and not a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, but if they're, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in their teens, like their input can be sought, through something like the Voice of the Child report. And their input isn't decisive, but it certainly carries a lot of weight. But sometimes the court will need to look at the reasons behind their input. If you have a parent who's trying to alienate the child from the other parent, then the fact that the kids are saying they want to be with the alienator, it's going to have less weight because they've been influenced. So, those kind of cases are very complicated because it's very difficult to prove, alienation and to show alienation. But which is the reason why, what a child says isn't necessarily decisive. But once children reach a certain age too, the saying is their feet will do the walking. So, if you have a 14-year-old and you're trying to make them go to a parent that they don't want to stay there, they can get on transit and go to the other parent or walk there or, get there somehow. So it's harder to kind of force a child that age to do something that they don't want to do. So, the older they get, the more their input matters.
Okay, how about this one? When getting divorced, assets need to be divided evenly. Is that the case, or is there some wiggle room there?
There's a process that's followed. So assets are not necessarily divided equally, which is something that I think generally, people think that. And again, I'm talking about here in Ontario. It could be different in some other, jurisdiction. But generally here in Ontario, what happens when you separate is the separation date is a very important date. It's called the valuation date. And so assets and liabilities are valued as of the separation date. And so each party completes a financial statement that lists all of their assets, all of their liabilities, and then it arrives at a number. And so if the numbers are both equal, then there's no equalization payment that has to be made. If one party has 0 and the other party has 100,000, then they would have to give the other person 50,000, so it would be equal. But very seldom are both numbers the same, because sometimes people have a pension, or they have an RRSP, or they have a bank account or a credit card, or whatever it might be that's just in their name. So it ends up, when you add up all their assets and liabilities, you do come out with different numbers. And the rule of thumb is that whoever has the higher number is going to owe 50% of the difference to the other party to equalize it. But there's also things that get excluded, and there's very specific rules about how that's calculated. So you can't just generally say that somebody gets half. It's a little more complicated.
All right. And is that similar with spousal support? Like there's a special equation to try and figure out how much spousal support or
Well,
child
child
support is
support
given?
is pretty straightforward because we have the federal child support guidelines, which anyone can search up on the internet, um, on the Federal Justice Department's website. And, you just plug in the payor's income, how many children there are, and it shows a number. And so, and if it's a shared parenting type of thing, then you have to plug in both parents' income and the kids, and then they each get a number. And again, the one with the higher number would pay an offset support to the one with the lower number. Spousal support is a little more complicated. We have the spousal support advisory guidelines, which is part of a program all family lawyers here use called DivorceMate, where you plug in the numbers and DivorceMate will spit out what spousal support should be based on the length of the marriage, the ages of the parties, and things like that. But there's also something called compensatory support, which is more, I don't want to say airy-fairy, but it's more gray in terms of determining the amount. And compensatory support is a situation where, a woman gave up, I'm saying a woman, it could be a man, gave up her career to raise children. And so she stayed home and ran the household and raised children and took herself out of the workforce. And then then they got divorced. And so she's not able to earn the same type of income she might have been able to earn if she'd stayed in the workforce. So in a situation like that, she would be entitled to some compensatory support. And again, the factors that you look at are how long was she out of the workforce? What are her skills? What's her education? What is the job market like? And what's her age? I mean, for a 55-year-old woman to have to go out and work after being out of the workforce since she was, 30 is very different than, a 37-year-old woman who was home for 3 years, going back to the workforce, or a man. I'm saying women, but again, this could also be men. There are men who get spousal support and child support as well.
Okay, how about this one? All right, this one I hear a lot of between just friends and also clients I work with. So the partner starts to date again. How soon can they meet your children or be like even babysat by the new girlfriend or the new boyfriend? What are some rules around that and having your kids meet the new person in the
I
relationship?
think it partly depends on the ages of the children, but I tell people, a general rule of thumb is I think you should be separated, at least for a year before. And some people even put this in their separation agreements and things, either, 6 months or a year before children are introduced to a new partner. And and just like to me as a mom myself, I think that people should not be introducing new partners unless it's a serious relationship. I mean, often when you get separated and divorced, especially, and you've been in a long-term marriage, you want to go out there and play the field a little bit, because you haven't in a long time, and your children don't need to meet those people. But, obviously if it's evolving into a more serious relationship, you would want your children to meet them. So, I would say always exercise caution and be mindful of, if your child is struggling with the divorce, like the last thing they need is, oh God, now mom or dad is also dating someone. And, I think you need to be more, sensitive to that. Also, younger children don't understand it as much. So they might think that your new partner is trying to replace mommy or daddy, and, they don't understand. So I think you need to be more protective of younger children. Whereas, a 16-year-old meeting, you're going on a date, and, your 16-year-old may not even bat an eyelash, or they may. So again, it's just being sensitive to your children and what, where they're at. And part of it is, I think, just common sense as well. But it's interesting. I mean, I see people who get separated, who had an affair, get separated, and immediately are bringing the person they had the affair with into the children's lives. And, it's driving the other spouse crazy, and it's just creating so much unnecessary conflict. And I don't think that, from a best interest of the child perspective, that's really in their best interest. They're struggling with their parents separating. They don't need to have this new person thrown into their lives or be forced to move in, with them. But so people do all kinds of things, but that aren't necessarily child focused. But, I can't stress enough to listeners the importance of really, thinking about what is best for your children and focusing on that when you're looking at, your dating life.
Oh, such great advice. Is there anything else that I missed that you wanted to bring up in regards to some big myths out there that need to be dispelled when it comes to the divorce process?
I think one of the things, I think a lot of people are afraid of lawyers, and a lawyer is, generally somebody you're going to need through the divorce process. And so don't be afraid to talk to them and to get the information you need, because that's the only way you can make sure that you're getting, what you're entitled to, or at least you're aware of what you're entitled to. So if you choose not to pursue it, that's fine, but at least you know what you're waiving. And so I think it's important just to surround yourself with the right support team. Like, it could be a lawyer, a divorce coach, a therapist, financial advisor. All of those are people that I think it's important to build that team of support around you. And I guess the one very most important thing, if you're going through a divorce and you have children, is to keep your children out of it. Like, do not talk about the divorce with your children. Do not badmouth the other parent to your children. Do not try and make the children feel like they have to pick you over the other spouse. If your spouse had an affair, your children don't need to know that. So always put them first and don't involve them in it.
All right. Great advice. So how can any of our viewers who are watching the replay or from watching it live,
they can visit my
hold of
website, which is www.leannetownsend.ca, or they can visit the Mills and Mills website, which is www.millsandmills.ca, and they can find my profile there. Or they can also find me here on Instagram, Leanne Townsend Life, and they all have my contact information there.
Amazing. And Perfect. And anyone that's watching from your side, I'm Beth Miller. I am a marriage coach, and I help women save their marriages in 12 weeks. I work predominantly with the women, not the husband, and I help them transfer themselves, transform their relationship. But with that said, not all marriages can be saved, and sometimes I'm supporting those women as they gracefully and in their confidence exit a marriage. So that's one reason I wanted to bring you on, to kind of dispel some of the myths that are out there. And like you said, lawyers aren't scary. It's great to reach out to one. And I think one piece around lawyers is really the price. It's just so expensive. I think that's some of the fear too. It's intense. There's a lot of like words and laws that are really complicated to try and understand. So I love how you put that you know what, it's good to reach out to figure out what you're entitled to and what your rights are. So thank you so much for this conversation. I'd love to have you back on and talk about divorcing a narcissist.
Yeah, no, I'd love that too.
That was one of your topics. So maybe in the future we can schedule another one. Because I feel like
definitely.
That could be
and I should have you on my podcast as well.
Thank you so much.
To chat about that.
Let's do it. So yeah, send us any questions if you have any. I also have a free guide, 3 proven ways to save a marriage. So you can check that out in my Instagram bio as well. All right, Leanne, it's been great. And thank you everyone for watching. Bye.